Hello, everyone. Welcome to 1.5 Degrees, the podcast where together we explore the science, solutions, and stories involved in the fight against climate change. I'm your host, Heidi Pan, speaking with the professionals behind the latest research, policies, culture, and innovations shaping our response to global environmental challenges. For today's episode, we are joined by Dana R. Fisher, who is the director of the Center for Environment, Community, and Equity at American University and a professor in the School of International Service, to discuss the focus of her seventh and latest book, Saving Ourselves: From Climate Shocks to Climate Action, just out with Columbia University Press, and her research related to democracy, civic engagement, activism, and climate politics. Dr. Fisher is a non-resident senior fellow in the governance program at the Brookings Institution and the chair-elect of the political sociology section of the American Sociological Association. She was a contributing author for Working Group 3 of the IPCC Sixth Assessment Review, writing about citizen engagement and civic activism, and holds a PhD and Master's of Science degree from the Department of Sociology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and did her undergrad in East Asian Studies and Environmental Studies at Princeton University. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Fisher. It's truly an honor.
Thank you so much for having me, Heidi. I'm so happy to talk to you.
Yeah, so I mean, we're here to talk about your book, which was incredibly insightful, and I'm super excited for this conversation. I guess like just for context and for listeners, can you talk a little bit about the work that you do, and I guess like also how did you come to do the work that you do today?
So the work that I do is so I'm a sociologist, as I think you mentioned, and I study climate policy making. And, I study decision making generally around environmental issues, but I've really, honed in on studying climate policy making and have spent much of my career. So I started out doing my PhD in the late 90s. And since then, my dissertation was on climate change, climate policy making, and the Kyoto Protocol, as you know from the book. And I've been basically studying climate policy making since at both the international level as well as focusing specifically on climate policy making here in the United States. At the same time, I also have studied the role that civil society plays. And civil society is where activism and citizens and democracy, kind of the checks on democracy come from. And so historically, I've written books that are either on climate policy making or about civic engagement and activism. But for this book, I actually decided to bring these together because when I think about the climate crisis and where we are with the crisis and where we need to go, it's very clear that we really need citizens and people power for us to push forward to get to the other side of the climate crisis and to push policymakers to do what's needed. So I wrote this book, and I wrote it for a general audience because I've done a lot of academic books and academic papers, and I really wanted to get the word out to people who care about climate change like yourself.
Yeah, no, definitely. I guess like my question maybe also is just more into like kind of like the personal journey of getting into academia. I mean, like, I guess like where, why, and how did you come to focus on your research questions related to democracy, activism, and climate specifically?
Well, actually, so I think my biography probably will answer that question pretty easily. So I finished at Princeton. I did East Asian Studies and Environmental Studies. I was actually the first cohort of students who did environmental studies at Princeton. It was the early 90s.
Hmm.
When I came out, I came to DC. So I live here in DC now. I came to DC and I was all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed, and I was going to be doing stuff on the environment. So I started out in an environmental junior lobbyist position, where at the time this was during the Clinton administration. And at the beginning of the Clinton administration, there was an effort to try to pass a BTU tax, which would have been a tax that would have charged people based on their energy consumption, which would have addressed climate change. As you may recall, Al Gore was the vice president at the time, and there was a lot of interest in trying to do something about this thing called climate change that we didn't know nearly as much about then, but we knew we needed to do something about our energy consumption. So this was an effort to do it. It horribly failed, making it through the Congress, unfortunately. And so I basically was working on clean energy and clean energy budgets to try to fund more clean energy in the United States. And I try to do it through the system as a lobbyist, but I was young, I was female, still am, and but not as young anymore. But basically, as a result, I got stuck lobbying all the people who had no chance of ever changing their minds, which was really disheartening. But I also got to experience and learn about the political process and realize that working through it was not, I didn't like the whole way the process worked, and I really wanted to study it. And I had to do a senior thesis in college. I actually did my thesis on the environmental movement in Japan, because I was an East Asian Studies major.
Mhm.
And I really wanted to think about doing more research because I enjoyed doing research. While I was working at a think tank doing sustainability work in Asia, it became clear to me that I needed more degree, more knowledge. And I also was told by senior colleagues that without a PhD, I wasn't going to be allowed to run my own programs. So I went to graduate school specifically so that I could do my own projects. And I figured I would be doing it in the nonprofit space, probably going back to a think tank. But while I was in graduate school, I fell in love with sociology and with kinds of questions that we can ask and the kinds of answers we can get. And so when I finished, I ended up doing this dissertation that was about climate policymaking, looking at the different actors involved and the roles that they were playing in addressing climate change. And it was an amazing tool. And I loved the idea of going to talk to all these policymakers and asking them questions to try to understand how their positions were related to one another. So I kind of ended up, I found academia. It really wasn't where I was planning to go.
Mhm.
And I realized that because of my temperament and because of the kinds of questions I like to ask, it was a much better fit for me. But I also believed that, knowledge is power and that we can, I mean, like I like to say, I bring data to power, and that is, that's the work that I do. And I really believe that by asking the right questions and answering those questions, we can really change the world. So that's how I got here. Why I ended up studying democracy and climate policymaking was because I really care about environmental problems. I really care about the climate crisis, which is, I think, you know, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, challenge of our time. And as a result, I wanted to study that, and I wanted to understand how there could be an equitable transition to deal with the climate crisis and to get us through a just transition with regard to energy, and that requires democracy. So those are kind of the different components that came together for me to end up studying what I study and writing what I write, and all of that, and my experience as a contributing author to the IPCC led me to write my new book, which is really well, I'm calling it now a well-researched manifesto. And it's really about a manifesto for people generally who want to make a difference and who want to address climate change, to understand where we are, how we got here, and where we need to go. So that's my background.
Yeah, no, that's really cool. And I mean, just it's so important, the issues that you're researching, and they definitely fascinate me too, because I think we have to really understand how, what is not working, and whatever the society we're in is like, and whatnot, in order to really act within it properly. But I mean, like, I guess like one of the first things that you talk about in saving ourselves, to contextualize why we need to save ourselves in the first place, like you really focus first on dispelling, I guess, like the bystander effect. I mean, like there's also, I guess like some terms related to that, is like the diffusion of responsibility. I guess like I'm really curious about, your perspective on what the best counter is against that sort of diffusion from a government intervention standpoint and internally from a grassroots activism standpoint.
I would say is that when we think about government, I mean, our expectation has always been that if we elect the right people to office, given that we have a representative democracy, they will take care of us and they'll do what they say they're going to do. Unfortunately, there's lots and lots of research, including research that I have done, that shows that it just doesn't work that way when it comes to climate change. And that, as I lay out in the book early on, part of that is due to the fact that specific interests, most of them, we call them vested interests in the IPCC. They are fossil fuel interests that have had privileged access to power and resources. So resources in terms of getting access to natural resources that are subsidized so that they can extract them, right, off of public lands in many cases. And they also have privileged access to power in the form of elected officials and other governmental officials that help to continue to maintain that power. And as a result, the people in power are in some ways, captured by these interests, right? And that is due to the fact that right now in our country, particularly, companies can provide a lot of support for elections. And there's research that shows, and I talk about this in the book, that even Democrats who run saying they want to do something about climate change, if they take fossil fuel money, they do not vote in favor of the climate and in favor of you and me. They vote in favor of the people who gave them money, which is one of the reasons that getting money out of politics would be a really good idea. But so I lay out that that's why we need to recognize that if we just keep waiting for the government to act, we'll be waiting for way too long. With regard to the other side of this, which is civil society, and whether or not we can just assume that somebody else is going to do the work for us as an activist, the problem is that to address this problem, because there is such an asymmetry of power, we really need a mass mobilization. We really need all hands on deck, everybody working on. You don't have to be an activist. You don't have to throw food, right? You don't have to, block traffic. You can just be an activist and be highly engaged in your community. You can be an active citizen. You can work to help to address flooding issues in your community. You can help to make your community more sustainable. You can help to build resilience in your community, which is about creating a more densely connected society so that when climate shocks hit, and we know from the natural science, we know from the IPCC that they will more and more. People have already experienced climate shocks in the past. We are expected to have a very long, hot summer this summer, which is due to climate change as well as El Nino that are coming together. The fires have already started up in Canada, so we in the Northeast should expect to have wildfire smoke coming back down here. And as a result, we should not be waiting around for other people to step up, because it's going to take everybody pushing back against power to get our government and to get businesses all on deck to start doing something about the climate crisis at the level needed. Now, that's not to say that we haven't seen policymaking already that has worked towards addressing climate change. And there are many businesses that are also working towards addressing climate change. It's just that, as I talk about in the book, at this point, what's really viable is incremental politics. But the problem is that incremental policymaking tries to keep everybody happy. And when it does that, it tends to be less aggressive. And the problem is the climate crisis and addressing it requires systemic change. That means that we can't just be incremental here. We really have to shift the whole system.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I do really appreciate your approach in calling out how and where specifically fossil fuel interests are like, worryingly influential in just any system in America, like from you touched on the political ones from candidate campaign funding to, I think, do people call it Joe Manchin's dirty deal or whatnot? And yeah, and I mean, also like feel like just the bystander effect seems to be at play when it comes to our elections as well. Just everyone doesn't really vote because they think other people are going to vote. Research has found that the majority of Americans they do want to move away from fossil fuels. And you've previously written another book about how like political outsourcing is strangling progressive politics and the power of like the right in staying grounded in local communities and politics. So I guess like I really want to go into like you kind of touched on this before, but just in maybe more specific details, like what from your perspective got us to where we are today, where the climate interests of our political leaders in power aren't reflecting the concerns of the majority of Americans, and like what would it take to, fix that and have them represent our wishes?
I mean, first and foremost, I think that the situation is that the entire industrial revolution happened on, by burning coal, right? So it was the process of being able to electrify the world and power the industrial sector and power transportation that facilitated most of what we see today in the developed world. And really, initially, governments wanted to do that to help to industrialize, to help to build the countries, to help to develop the countries, to help to give all of us many of the things that we have today. And, I frequently get kind of nasty comments written to me on social media from people who still work in those sectors and say, I'm trying to shut them down and I don't understand the American way of life. And I'm very well aware of the American way of life. The problem is that at this point, this way of life and the way that we have used energy and the way that energy is produced in much of the world, and particularly here in the United States, is harming the environment and is going to basically lead us to devastation in many different ways because of the way that the climate crisis is expanding and the way that carbon concentrations are continuing to grow in our atmosphere. So given that's the case, the question is, originally the government really gave opportunities for companies and industry to expand their use of fossil fuels, because by doing that, they knew that the country would grow. And there tends to be a pretty clear relationship between economic development and consumption of fossil fuels, at least to a point. And so many countries, pushed for that. Most countries did. And here in the United States, the United States wouldn't be where it is today without extracting fossil fuels. And one of the reasons the United States is as strong as it is because we have an amazing amount of natural resource endowment in terms of fossil fuels. For example, right now, you may or may not know this, that the United States is the #1 exporter of oil in the world and natural gas, right? Oil, I'm always surprised by, because I would have thought that a country in the Middle East would be bigger than us, but it's not. So right now, we are an amazing net exporter of fossil fuels. But, we bring in a lot of money that way. The problem is that when this whole thing started, everybody thought this would be great. We want to bring in money. We want to develop and industrialize. But nobody was thinking about how this was having an effect on the unintended consequence of harming the environment. But it's very clear now that that's happening. And so the question is, how do we shift this entire system away from what it was built on? And that's the question that has really haunted everybody who's been involved in climate policy making since the 1990s, when the climate regime was begun in 1992. Sorry. So it's very clear at this point, having done research since the 1990s on this, that the only way forward is systemic change. We can't just slowly move away from fossil fuels. We have to, at this point, really address it, and address it quickly. But in addition to that, it's very clear that there are certain interests that are going to fight back as hard as they can to continue making money and capitalizing on their privileged access to these resources. So that is why we really need to not wait around for government to do something about it. I mean, it is true that, like, in a theoretical world, and I was just talking to somebody about this earlier this week. In a theoretical world, we had all the time in the world, and we didn't have to worry about how the climate crisis is worsening. Incremental policy making would work, and eventually we would get ourselves off of fossil fuels, because that is the natural progression. The problem is it's just not happening fast enough, given what we know about the models and the degree to which the world is warming.
Yeah, like as you outlined, there's like a lot, broken within our system, and it's not enough to do the bidding of fossil fuel interests and fall into their distractions like the carbon footprint, which I wanted to ask more about later on. But a statistic that you referenced in the book that I found really illustrative of this is that like even an and I'm paraphrasing, but like even an American living in like a homeless shelter would have a carbon footprint that is essentially double that global average. So I mean, we definitely need a whole system overhaul and an anthro shift as the term that you used. But like as you mentioned, time is of the essence. I guess like where in your mind are some of the major areas that we need to prioritize and affect change in first, I guess, as part of the anthro shift that we need?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to start by saying, so that carbon footprint statistic that I talk about is actually this great study that was done by undergraduates at MIT. And somebody needs to do a new version of that. But it's very true that if you look at in the developed world, because of how much we are systemically locked into our energy consumption, even if you live in a homeless shelter, you have a very high carbon footprint in comparison to most of the developing world. So I just wanted to mention that. But I also, in terms of like how to get to an anthro shift, that's one of the questions that I have focused on in a lot in my work and in my collaboration with a colleague of mine at University of British Columbia named Andrew Jorgensen, where we started to think through how you get to a point where we see all the different social actors that make decisions and address and affect, the environment, how we get them to shift around. And what we find is that you really need a shock to the system and a universal sense of risk. We saw that a little bit in the beginning of COVID, but during the beginning of COVID, what happened was the world shut down and everybody hid in their houses because we were all afraid, right? However, over time, people became, desensitized to the risk. Some people got sick and didn't die, and we're like, it's not that bad. Some people got vaccinated. A lot of people got really frustrated and decided that the risk wasn't worth it for them to stay inside their houses, and they started protesting. So based on that research and the experience of COVID, we know that there needs to be a very high sense of risk and about personal loss for people to make real systemic changes and to push for systemic changes, because it's not going to be easy. And so what I talk about in the book is how we need to see and experience climate shocks firsthand to get us to the point where we're willing to make those kinds of changes and to push for those kinds of changes. And the question that I ask in the book is how much shock are we going to have to experience before enough people are ready to push for that kind of systemic change? And I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that people who experience climate shock in terms of kind of these extreme events that are due in part to climate change are much more likely both to want to do something about the climate crisis. And when I've done research on people who are actually out in the streets, protesting, many of them, in fact, like over 85% of them report having personally experienced climate shocks and feeling angry and sad about it. And that's what gets them out in the streets. So we know that, but I think the big question is how much and how bad does it have to get before what we call this windows of opportunity that the research talks about after disaster open up for real innovative policy change, which is what is needed to get us to do this kind of systemic shift.
Yeah, and something that really struck me while just reading that is that, like the people that are in power, that are really capable of affecting change, other than, the people, obviously, in democratic systems, like they are the last to really feel those effects, really. And so, I mean, I really appreciate the kind of outlining of nonviolent direct action that you go into in the history of that, in terms of like that is kind of bringing the effects into their backyards. One of the pieces of guidance that you kind of conclude on is the advice to like capitalize on moral shocks. I guess like could you for context kind of define what moral shocks is and highlight some examples related to the impacts of climate that not everyone might be aware of, and what does capitalizing on them look like, or what can that look like?
Sure. Let me take a step back if it's okay with you and just talk
Yeah,
about
yeah,
the
yeah.
book ends with 3 suggestions, right? So I say that this is, in contrast to other books I've written that are more academic, this one ends with suggestions about what we can all do. So the first 2 are to people who want to engage in activism. The first one is we need to create community and build real solidarity. And this involves both thinking through how to be more intersectional in our activism and be more connective and built within our communities, right? And I talk about solidarity with labor, for example, because the environmental community, the climate community has not worked particularly well with labor historically. And as a result, they tend to have a lot of conflict. And this kind of community building and expansion of the movement is really, really necessary to help build strength. Because when different groups are fighting against one another, it's much harder for them to actually be successful. So that's number 1. Number 2 is the one you were talking about, which is capitalizing on moral shocks, including violence. So I have 2 different kinds of shocks in the book. I have what I call the climate shocks, which are these experiences of extreme events like your floods, your hurricanes, your tornadoes, your extreme heat, your sea level rise, that are well documented to be exacerbated by climate change. And then I have moral shocks, which are the experiences that people who are engaging in activism have due to violence, particularly. And here I talk about the ways that moral shocks, which were experienced during the civil rights movement, when people were engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience and were repressed, beaten up, attacked by counter-protesters, how that was used by the movement to help to expand who participated in the movement. Sorry. But another example of this that we can see more recently is, if you remember the summer of 2020, a very well-known moral shock was the horrible experience of watching George Floyd get murdered on social media by while he was unarmed by a police officer. Many people reported going into the streets and participating in protests after that because they were so morally outraged by that experience of observing it and bearing witness to it. Another example of a moral shock would be when the nonviolent protesters who were out in Washington, D.C. at Lafayette Square got tear gassed. And that was like a repressive act by the government against them to try to disperse the crowd when people were not breaking the law and they were just being nonviolent because President Trump wanted to do this photo op. And that was really, in a lot of ways, seen as violence against these activists. And because of that, we saw the people on the streets expand by 2 or 3 times as many right after that, because more people come out after they experience or observe kind of moral, have moral shocks. And when that happens, it helps to expand the community of people who are protesting.
Mm.
And then the final thing I talk about, just because since I'm doing all three, is I say that we need to cultivate resilience in our communities. And what I mean here is not just environmental resilience in terms of weatherproofing our houses or making our communities capable of handling extreme heat, big floods that are going to happen because of extreme weather, but also build community and build the capacity within our community for social resilience. Because when extreme weather hits, people get unhoused, people need help, people need support, and we need to have strong ties in our communities to be able to help and support them.
No, communities definitely should be emphasized. And yeah, no, again, I also really appreciate that, you balance, pointing out the issues and then also creating this sort of guide to follow on for readers. This kind of goes back to that like reference to your other book. It was really also insightful to me while I was, researching this, just to see that like so far we're doing a lot of outsourcing and not really tying into community in terms of, affecting change. And yeah, like to call that out is I guess like I just would love to learn more about that as well,
Well, I'm delighted that you're talking about. So that was my second book. My second book was called Activism Inc. How the Outsourcing of Grassroots Campaigns is Strangling Progressive Politics in America. It was a very strong subtitle. And in that book, I actually was studying canvassing, which you still see today, people standing on the street and asking you for money and stopping you for progressive causes, and the ways that those campaigns were outsourced to organizations that ran those campaigns for many different progressive groups, where specifically young people were treated as these kind of replaceable cogs in this progressive machine to fundraise. And I tracked how that worked on the left versus the right. It was much more common and prevalent on the left. And then I spent a lot of time with these young people to find out what it did to them. And what it basically did is it led them to be disenfranchised and disillusioned with politics in America. And I tracked it into how that connects these young people who are no longer feeling connected to politics and wanting to do politics with the way the political system on the left tends not to really get into our local communities, which is very different from the right. And so I identified these asymmetries, and that book was published in, I think, 2006. And then I wrote my last book before Saving Ourselves, was called American Resistance. And I start that book by talking about why, about the election of Donald Trump and why we saw the resistance come up the way we did. And one of the reasons for that was because there was a lack of local political infrastructure on the left, which is exactly what so I start that book, my most recent book, saying, I wrote in 2006 about this and nothing has changed. In fact, it's gotten worse. And that's really the problem, is if we continue to think about, we don't even need to think about left versus right, but if we do think about left versus right, there are very different ways that the different sides of the political spectrum engage in community and connect people in community and try to build, bridges and avenues for young people to get involved in politics. And because of the way the left does it, first of all, there's not a lot of there when we get down to the community level, which is problematic when disaster strikes. It's also problematic when we face a challenging election, because all of a sudden you have to figure out, how are you going to get young people to care about an election and to vote and to work on politics at the local level when they're not really connected at all.
Yeah. No, it was just, and seeing the date that the book was published, which is when I was born, I was like, it's like just nothing, the fact that nothing has changed, and it's incredibly worrying, but also just to know that that is one of the reasons. And how could we, I guess reapproach it is really insightful. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I mean, I think that one of the takeaways from that book is that we really need to reinvest in our democracy. And it's kind of, well, interesting or sad, depending on how you feel on a given day, that we haven't really invested in our democracy. And that's one of the reasons that we have the problems we have today. For what it's worth, I actually have a film version of the book that I'm working on trying to get out right now, because I think that the message is so important. And I particularly think it's important as we see young people starting to struggle with how to engage in politics for the 2024 election. I know a lot of people are trying to decide what to do, what they should do, given how they feel about the different candidates and the policies that we've seen so far. And it's a real challenge, and it's going to be a challenge moving forward. But fixing our democracy has got to be one of the top things we do, along with addressing the climate crisis, of course.
Yeah, I mean they go hand in hand in a lot of ways for sure. Yeah. Um, I guess this is kind of like a sort of final question on saving ourselves before we kind of like maybe zoom out a little bit. But I guess just like I also really appreciate how this, it really redefines and shifts focus from what I think is a commonly accepted, but as you highlight, it's kind of like a really truly broken concept of what individual responsibility looks like. And I mean like even in my own experience, like my earliest memory was like I was learning about climate change and helping the environment in terms of recycling and reducing my own carbon footprint, just if I BP. And I mean, I
I know.
also
Can you
had
believe,
like,
like, to know that the fossil fuel companies did that on purpose, right? I mean,
yeah, yeah,
it's terrible to realize that.
it
Go
was
ahead
it
though.
was a,
Sorry.
oh no, no, and oh, no, it was definitely hugely shocking to me to learn about it, but also like just when now that I've learned about, like where that came from and how it's just a huge distraction, yeah, it's horrifying. But I mean, I also had like a conversation recently with the teacher who asked me whether or not it's worth going through the effort of sorting recycling if, for example, the US recycling system doesn't work. So I guess just like applying this broadly to broken environmental systems that we currently live within, is it like worth continuing to talk about, taking Navy showers and going vegan and turning down our thermostats altogether?
Oh, that's a great question. And I actually, well, so I personally believe that we should do everything we possibly can. So I recycle, whether, and I know, and my niece constantly likes to point out to me that it doesn't work, but I still can't. I mean, I can't not recycle, but I
Mhm.
also think that we should do everything we can in our everyday lives, right? I mean, like I say in the book, we put solar panels on the house, drive an electric car, I compost, I don't eat meat, and I do all these things with the hope that every little bit counts. But I know that even if I do everything I can in my everyday life, unless we change the system, it just won't work. Unless you want to go live, like you can go live completely off the grid, out in the wilderness, that would make a difference too. But, most people aren't going to do that. And I certainly do not want to do that.
It's kind of both at the same time. I think so as well. And that's kind of I tried my best. I was like, we got to all try our best and focus on reducing or whatnot. It would with regards to recycling specifically. I mean,
Well, the other
um,
thing that I would just say is that a
mhm,
good response to that is that when you take personal action, you can actually measure that and show what you're able to contribute to solving the climate crisis. And by starting there, you can talk about what you've done, but we know it's not enough. And then you use that as a pivot to talk about what else is needed
mhm.
and how there are these other levers in society that can be used to make more difference, much more difference, because they run the systems, right?
Yeah, yeah, well, definitely. So I guess like we should be saving ourselves not just in the sense of, working within the broken system, but also like utilizing social pressure and nonviolent direct action and whatnot to fix that system.
Absolutely. All of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, thank you so much for just, yeah, the book is really, really insightful again. And I mean, I guess just like maybe from a standpoint of just being a writer, like what were some of the challenges that you navigated while writing it? And yeah, I guess like just what was the writing process like?
This book, I mean, I guess every book I've written, I've been very close to, but this book I was really close to because I really wanted this to be a message and make it accessible and get it out. And I wanted it to be timely. So, as you may notice, there's a conversation about COP28 in there. So I kept revising every step of the way as we got to publication so that it could be as up to date as possible, which is the first time I did that. But I struggled really to start the book. So I was on this fellowship at the Library of Congress 2 summers ago, and my plan was to have the book done then. And I just couldn't do it because I didn't feel ready. And as I was spending all my time in the reading room, which anybody who ever comes to Washington, D.C., you've got to go see the Library of Congress reading room. It's the most beautiful room in all the United States, I swear. So check it out. It's easily accessible because it is part of the US government. So you can get in there for free and check it out. So definitely check it out. But so I was there and I was coding my data. So I was reading through all of these transcripts of interviews I'd done with people over a number of years. And it was really clear to me as I was reading that and thinking through the argument of the book that I needed to talk more to the activists who were starting to be more engaged in confrontational activism and using radical tactics to understand why they made that choice and
Mhm.
how they think that that's going to fill this gap. And so I basically, I did the work at the reading room, but I also ended up going out and doing all these interviews that summer. And those interviews were extremely valuable. And it was interesting because it was that was, as people were starting to get more confrontational. I don't think any soup had been thrown yet at that point.
Mm.
But I mean, people were doing, blocking buildings and using crazy glue. And we started to see the kind of, I'm using my air quotes for radical tactics that we see today. Although, uh, these tactics are very, very bland compared to the kind of tactics that we saw during, women's suffrage or during the civil rights movement. But this is how it begins. So I was asking people about where they thought it would need to go and how we would get there. So, so it took me a while, but I think I finally got the tone and I was able to get the message out and try to get it into people's hands. It was interesting because the final process, I've never been so impatient though to get it out so we could start talking about it.
It's definitely a very ongoing conversation. I really appreciate this part of it. Like, I mean, maybe just broadly, do you have a favorite or least aspect of what you do today?
What's my least favorite aspect of what I do?
Favorite or least favorite or both?
Well, my favorite part is actually talking to young people and teaching and talking about, well, one of the things that I really hope to do is to get the message out to, to the next generation, because you guys, I mean, I know you guys are inheriting a bunch of mess that we started, well, not me, the people older than me started. But I also know that you guys are the first generation that cares as deeply as you do. And as such, I have a lot of confidence that you guys have a lot more capacity to get where we need to go and to help push us to get where we need to go. And so, as a sociologist, when I started out teaching, people weren't as excited to have these kinds of conversations. And I'm just thrilled that people are, and to talk about how you can bring your own personal knowledge to power and use, the levers that you have available to you to make, to put pressure on decision makers to make a difference. And so I think that's my favorite part. My least favorite is, I don't know. It depends on the day.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah, and I mean, also, I guess, like, just on the subject of that, what advice do you have for those, obviously, in addition to the book, which I will highly recommend people read, would you say, I guess, like, for listeners who might be interested in either going into academia and the work that you do now, or just want to get into a green career, or, get into activism for
I would say you should follow your bliss, because you do not
Mhm.
want to take on a job that you hate, because working sometimes sucks anyway. You may as well, you need to pick something you're going to love. I mean, I love my
Mm,
work every day, even on the days that I don't love what I'm doing, I still love my work.
mm,
And it's really lucky to have a job like that. But if you can try to do that, I mean, I also think that there is something really valuable about going and learning about an issue and then thinking about where you fit in it. So I encourage people to do that. Finally, I would just say that one of the things that I'm working on now is I'm working with folks in the administration on what will end up becoming the American Climate Corps, and looking
mm,
at how young people are getting opportunities to work through Service Corps programs to help the environment and help the climate. And there are all these amazing free programs that I didn't know existed, although most of them didn't exist when I was younger, that exist today that can fund you to do semesters abroad, years, channel your work into working with the government. And I just would encourage everybody to check out these programs, because in terms of building resilience in our communities, these programs are amazing, and most people don't know about them at all.
mm. Yeah, I guess, like, what would be those programs, and I guess, like, any other resources that you would recommend?
I I would suggest people check out AmeriCorps generally. AmeriCorps has a number of different programs at the state level as well as nationally through the NCCC program that are all working on really interesting aspects of the climate crisis. The other thing is the National Park Service has a number of different youth corps programs that are working in national parks, either at, in individual parks, or there's like a cool new program that I'm studying now, which is called the Scientists in Parks program, which
Mm.
is not for scientists, it's for people who want to be scientists to get involved. And you get to go work in different parks and do actual, work around climate.
Thank you so much for sharing those. And I guess this is kind of like we're winding down, like the kind of question I ask every episode. If you could turn back time, butterfly effects aside, and tell your younger self something that you've learned from life so far, or your research, what would you say to them?
Well, I think I would just tell myself to don't get down and keep on keeping on, because
Mm.
I mean, my path to writing this book and to getting where I am was not easy. I mean, it wasn't, I mean, certainly I didn't struggle like other people do because I
Mm,
had lots of privilege and experience and opportunity in my life. But there were times where I really thought I was going to give up and I really questioned myself. You know, I came out of college and I got mocked by a lot of people for trying to
mm,
do environmental work instead of, going a corporate job or going to law school. I got a lot of pressure from my family to go to law school and I refused to go. Um, and instead, I worked in the nonprofit sector and I took a bunch of jobs to figure out what I wanted to do. And then I ended up in grad school and and then a lot of people said that was the wrong thing and I shouldn't have done that. But obviously I questioned my decisions a whole bunch along the way. But I never would be here today and have done the things I've done if I hadn't followed that path. I lived in all different parts of the country. I'm really happy that I didn't just stay on I grew up outside Philadelphia and I'm glad I didn't stay right on the East Coast. I'm glad I got that experience of living in different places, um, and having different jobs and getting to find what made me the most excited. So I think that people should be not too impatient to figure out what exact profession you want to be because, you need to take the time to figure out what's going to make you happiest and where you can contribute the most. And I
mm,
think there's nothing wrong with taking time to do more school or to take time off before you do more school to figure it
yeah,
out. So that's what I would tell myself is that it's going to be okay and you are going to be able to help. It's like, I don't know that I'm not going to solve the climate crisis by myself, but hopefully I'm going to help people to think about how we can all do it together because it's going to take all of us.
yeah, definitely. Yeah, I really, I guess, like relate to that. Um, Obviously we don't have the same exact experiences, but that aspect of getting mocked for going into environmental stuff, there are some people in my life that have, gone that way. And I mean, I guess just like for other listeners that are kind of experiencing that spot, whether they're facing some sort of, discrimination because of their, I guess, like any advice related to that?
Well, I would just say anybody who's being mocked, you should just remember that anybody who's mocking you is just doing it out of
Mm,
insecurity and forget them. It's be you because one thing that the worst thing to do is try to be somebody else because you
mm,
feel the social pressure to be somebody else. And I mean, I'm not saying that from a position where I have not felt that pressure and tried myself in my younger days. But at this point, I think the biggest thing you can do that won't just help you become who you're meant to be, but will help the planet is be who you're meant to be.
mm,
And forget people. If people aren't willing to accept what you want to do and why you want to do it and who you want to be, no matter your race, your gender, your orientation, then forget them. And they're just going to hold you back. And you want to just, I mean, it can be sad to let go of people who are critical of you, who you thought should be, supporters of you. But I think the best thing you can do is just have faith
mm,
that you know who you're meant to be way more than anybody else does. And just
mm.
have faith in that and just know that by the time you hit 20, 30, even 40 years down the line, you're going to be proud that you did it. And it's going to be really, really important.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, that really resonates for sure. And I mean, I guess like, I definitely highly again encourage listeners to read Saving Ourselves, which you can order from. I'm gonna put links in the description. For listeners who want to keep up with the work that you do, where can they find you?
So you should just follow me. Well, you can follow me on Instagram. You can follow me on LinkedIn. I do have a TikTok, Fisher_Dana R, which I'm working on, but
I don't even
but
have a
um,
TikTok yet, but
check it out. I got a lot of encouragement to do TikTok, and my daughter helped me a little bit. So
Mm,
check it out. There's not that much there, but I'm going to continue to try. It's hard, but I'm trying. Do not look for me on Twitter because I am going to be off Twitter as soon as I possibly can, but I am not putting stuff there at this point. But if you so but the easiest way to find out where I am and what I'm doing is just go to my website, which is danarfisher.com. And you could maybe spell that out. I don't know. So yeah, and I'm going to be all over. So please come out to an event if you're in the area, and if you have a book, I'm happy to sign your book, and I'd love to meet you and just find out you heard about it through Heidi's podcast.
cool. Yeah, and there's a code for listeners if you wanted to reach or I guess
Yes, the code for if you go to the Columbia University Press site for the book, you just go to the book there. And if you go to my website, you can get to that. The code is CUP, Columbia University Press 20. So CUP 20 gets you 20% off the book.
Oh,
Use
super
it.
cool. Yeah, no, thank you so much again, Dr. Fisher, for taking the time to speak with me today. I really learned a lot.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful chatting.